I'd like to thank you all for coming to this extra session here in the evening. This arose out of the fact that I'm giving a talk tomorrow, which many of you could not attend, and that we had some really vigorous discussions over dinner and even late into the evening last night. So those of you who have been participants in those discussions will hear some things repeated. My apologies for that ab initio, but I do hope that you will learn something, and if you come to this talk as someone with Christian faith, I hope you will find your faith strengthened. If you come to this as someone who is quite sure Christianity is false, I hope that it annoys you. So my objective in that case is to put a stone in your shoe. I like to start these talks with an epigraph, and I could think of nothing better to use here than some of the words from the prologue to the Gospel of Luke. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. I hope by the time we're done you can understand why I would choose that as an epigraph for the talk. Our goal is quite simple. It's to build a cumulative case with many pieces of evidence that the authors of the Gospels were well informed and that they were habitually truthful. And here I have to confess, I'm only going to give you 9 or 10 lines of argument, and these are culled from more than 100 that I have prepared in slides. But to have mercy upon you and not keep you here past 5 in the morning, we have windows, and I remember the story of Eutychus in the book of Acts. So I don't want anyone to fall out and break your neck, because I don't think I would be able to do what St. Paul could do. So I will try to keep this short. However, an inevitable byproduct of that is that there are many points where you might wonder, well, can something more be said? Or, well, you didn't deal with this or that objection. And so I'll have a question and answer time, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might offer. I do not promise to have all the answers. I am not the Bible answer man. That's not my gift. But I have been studying these things for some time past, and I might be able to shed some light on something. I like to make maps, conceptual maps. And so in this case, I'd like to map things out in terms of positive evidence and the negative problems, the discrepancies and objections people can raise. And then I'd like to break it down the other direction between external evidence and internal evidence. What I've put in each category is only illustrative. There are more things that can go in the upper right quadrant than undesigned coincidences, but just for the purpose of this evening's talk, that's all that I will have time to cover. So you'll see that I've just sort of set some things out there. In one case, there's actually a crossover between these two categories, because something that is claimed to be a historical discrepancy turns out to be a confirmation instead. You'll see that one when we come to it. I'm going to begin with the external evidence and what I call the incidental confirmations. And so, again, in all of tonight's talk, I will be concentrating on the upper two quadrants. I have other lectures that I give regarding the various objections and discrepancies, so-called, and things of that sort, but it's just too much material to go into here. So I'm going to start up here, and let's talk about the secular evidence. There are two kinds of secular evidence, non-Christian evidence, that we might look for the historical reliability of the Gospels. One is that we could look for non-Christians mentioning major events in the Gospels, but the fact is, non-Christians rarely noticed or cared. You probably can think of some obscure, crazy cult somewhere that you read on the internet. They did something weird, but you're probably not running out to make that a subject of deep investigation. You probably don't typically write about it unless you happen to be like where something goes down. Yeah, crazy people believe crazy things. They're out there. Who cares? So if we're going looking for that kind of evidence, we're liable to be disappointed. And there's another reason for that, which is that non-Christians who became convinced of the central claims of the Christian faith became Christians. So then their evidence, some people say, well, don't you have any non-Christian evidence? Well, the people who took the time to look into it became Christians, and that makes for a problem with trying to look for non-Christian evidence. But we can also do something else. We can look at this in a totally different way. Instead of looking for the major events in the Gospels, or looking for some Roman to say that Jesus rose from the dead, but I don't believe Christianity. Instead, we're looking for places where the Gospels mention in passing facts about the historical setting. The more casual the mention, the better. The more obscure the facts, the better. Because what that will show is that these are authors who are close up to the facts. It is very hard to write a historical novel in a world without Wikipedia. If I say to you, I'd like you to write a short story about the French resistance during World War II. Oh, by the way, how much did a bottle of wine cost and what was the currency back in 1942? Would you know without looking it up? Most of us would not, right? And we have vast resources available, but we'd immediately go and Google what was the French currency and how much did this cost, because we just don't know. It's not easy to get small things right when you are writing a historical novel and you're not close up to the facts and you're just inventing things. So just to summarize what I'm going to claim that the authors of the Gospels get hard things right, things that it's not trivially easy for them to have known if they were not close to the time, close to the events. So I'm going to do 4 facts here. I like acronyms, so I spell the word fact down the side. I hope that pleases someone. I'm going to talk about faulty geography in Mark, Archelaus in Matthew, a coin in Luke, and the temple in John. And I've chosen one example from each of the Gospels. There are other examples in each of the Gospels, but again, I'm trying to economize and not impose too much upon your time. If you want more, at the end of the entire talk, I'll have my email address up on a slide. You're very welcome to write to me. I'll share with you maybe more than you would like. But if you enjoy drinking out of a fire hose, have we got a show for you? So, all right, let's talk about faulty geography. This is a claim that's been made that in Mark 7:31, the author of the second gospel, whom I will just refer to as Mark, makes a geographical error and thereby betrays his lack of knowledge of Palestine. So here's the claim. It's just a stray bit of Jesus' itinerary, right? A very boring thing. You have never heard a sermon preached on Mark 7:31. Then he, Jesus, returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Hard to find inspiring words to say about that little bit of Jesus' travel itinerary. But there's an interesting problem. Here's the problem. If we glance at a map, you see that Tyre is here, Sidon is here, and the region of the Decapolis is down here. Now, if you were going to go from Tyre to the region of the Decapolis, why wouldn't you go straight down to the Decapolis? Why would you go north to go south? I suppose we could say, well, maybe Jesus had some reason he wanted to go to Sidon. But you know, and I know, what the New Testament critics would say if you made such a lame shift at an explanation. Oh, you're just going to do anything to harmonize this and to make it come out right. Come on, be a serious scholar. Admit that Mark just doesn't know what he's talking about. And in fact, many commentators have said just that. So here's from a commentary about a decade ago, Adam Wynne, The Purpose of Mark's Gospel. Many interpreters have noted this awkward route as evidence that Mark was unfamiliar with the geography of Palestine and Galilee. It seems difficult to believe that a person living in Galilee who is educated enough to produce such a gospel as Mark would be unfamiliar with the geographical relationship between Tyre and Sidon. I love it when modern biblical critics lead with their chin. This is a boxing term. These people sitting at their library tables in Tübingen, which are nice and flat, and rolling out their nice flat maps and tracing lines in 2 dimensions. Let's go beyond that, shall we? Here's a topographical map of Palestine. Here's Tyre. Here's Sidon. Oh, what's this orange stuff in here? Oh, 1208. That's meters. Okay? And what's this? Well, this is right down here by the Sea of Kinneret, or of Galilee. This is a negative 210. That's 210 meters below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is the world's lowest freshwater lake. How many of you have done any climbing around in mountains? Anybody like to do some hiking? Right. So let me tell you what it's like, and stop me when I get it wrong. You start at the base of the mountain and you look up at a point at the top. You say, that's where I want to go. And then you just march straight up the mountain, up to the top, and then right over, right? Is that how it works? Yeah, right, 9. Not how it works. Any serious rough terrain, you're going to be doing switchbacks. You'll come to a thicket that you've got to go around. It's very hard to ascend a mountain that doesn't have a nice paved road going right over the crown, right? Sorry, the orange, where am I going? I'm going here, yeah. The orange region here, that seems to thin out right about there, and then it gets really severe as we go to the Golan Heights and stuff up in this region. But there's this little region right here where we're coming over to the Jordan River. Oh, that's an elevation of just 70 meters. And what's the elevation here at the coastline? It is sea level. 0 is the elevation at sea level, right? So to go from 0 to 70 doesn't seem too bad. If you go up here around the shoulder of this mountain, plus, you'll notice there's a little rivulet coming in here. You'll have some water. That rivulet is running to the sea, of course, not back from it. So you'll have fresh water all the way down the Jordan River Valley till you reach your destination. And if you've done much hiking in an arid climate, you'll understand that water actually matters. This is just a picture of Mount Meron today. Notice the northern shoulder of it dropping down to present a much less formidable obstacle for those who want to cross it. No further comment seems necessary. I think Mark actually knew the geography of Palestine. Thank you. Let's take something from Matthew. There's a curious verse in Matthew chapter 2, which many people wish to write off as wholly unhistorical. Joseph has taken Mary and the infant Jesus and fled from the regions of Jerusalem, from Bethlehem, and gone down into Egypt. And then, as Matthew tells us, he hears that Herod the Great, the one who sought the child's life, is dead. So he starts going back up towards Judea, towards Jerusalem. And then this happens. When Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. So he went up and around into the north instead of going right back to where they had come from. Here's what's awkward about this. He already knew that Herod the Great was dead. And Archelaus was Herod the Great's oldest living son. And it was quite common for a client king of the Romans to will the center, the heart of his kingdom, to his oldest living son. So he could pretty well have known that Archelaus was going to be taking over. That doesn't seem to have stopped him until something comes to him as bad news. But Matthew doesn't tell us what it is. So there's something awkward that's happened here, but couldn't he already have known? I mean, if it was just Archelaus is generally a rotter, we hate him, well, he could have known that without some special news. So why does this cause him to change plans? Nothing in Matthew will tell you the answer. Fortunately, we have a Jewish historian, Josephus, who in his Antiquities of the Jews tells us more about Archelaus. This is the only time Archelaus is ever mentioned in the New Testament. This just is dropped into the pond and the ripples move outward and go elsewhere, and we never hear any more about him. Here's the backstory about Archelaus. Just before Herod the Great died, it was just 2 weeks or less before Passover, and hundreds of thousands of Jews made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover at this time. Josephus says 3 million Jews a year. Let's suppose he was exaggerating and say it was only 300,000. Still a lot of people, right? Well, one of the last things that Herod the Great had done before he died was to have 2 Jews burned alive for sedition. They were leaders in the community. There had been a dispute about some shields that he had had hung up over the gates of the temple. They thought this was a violation of their right to religious autonomy. They put some young men up to climbing up and lowering themselves by ropes and chopping down the shields. And they never did find the young men, but they found the people who put them up to it, and he had them killed. And that was enormously unpopular. And so as the feast approached, what was the big news for pilgrims coming into Jerusalem? Herod, just before he died, had 2 righteous men burned alive. Passover pilgrims were not happy about this. And a large group of Passover pilgrims, with their sacrifices in hand, got into an argument with a small group of Roman soldiers. Things got hot. The Passover pilgrims put down their sacrifices, picked up stones, stoned the soldiers. Most of them died. And then they picked their sacrifices back up and they ran into the temple. Holy ground, or as we used to say when I was a kid, I'm on base. You can't touch me, right? Archelaus, who had just stepped into leadership because his father had just died, had had no time to go to Rome and get any kind of formal authority, panicked. So he sent a troop of armed horsemen to surround the temple with orders, don't let anyone outside go in and don't let anyone inside go out. And then he sent troops directly into the temple, and they slaughtered 3,000 Jews in the temple itself, shedding blood within the temple. Passover was canceled that year. Archelaus told the Jews, go home. Okay, now, back on that road up from Alexandria towards Bethlehem and Jerusalem, come Joseph and Mary and the young Jesus, and whom do they meet on the road? Thousands upon thousands of would-be Passover pilgrims fleeing Jerusalem, saying, Archelaus has shed blood in the temple. Thousands of people are killed. Now, you know what? Joseph was not a low-watt bulb, as we say. Joseph could put things together, like left Bethlehem and the region of Jerusalem to avoid a homicidal maniac on the throne, and now I'm headed back up there, and there's a brand new homicidal maniac on the... You know what? I have some property up in Galilee. That sounds like a good place to go, right? So they encounter the news of the massacre. They're not eager to go back to some place where there's just been another massacre. So they don't. Now it makes perfect sense. But notice how casually the fact is just mentioned. When he heard that Archelaus was reigning in his father's place, he was troubled. By the way, just minor point here, that word reigning is a participle in Greek. He does not say when he heard that Archelaus was king. He says when he heard that he was kinging, that he was reigning. Archelaus never did become the king of anything. He went to Rome. He asked Caesar Augustus for permission to step into the kingship. And Caesar, perhaps having heard some wind of some disquiet when Archelaus was first taking power, said, well, no, I don't think we're going to do that right now. Why don't you just try, you try running things there for a while, but I'm not going to give you the title of king. You're not going to get that title yet. Wait. We'll see whether you get it. And Archelaus horribly mismanaged things and was deposed, and everything went south. But I like that fact that Matthew does not say when Archelaus was a king. He says when he was reigning, which is a different thing, right? Small details. Also, and just while we're on the matter of details, Archelaus was deposed about 10 years after after he began, when Jesus would have been about 12, which is the age Jesus is said to have been in Luke chapter 2 when his parents took him to Jerusalem, which is the first time we have any mention of his going to Jerusalem. This is a conjecture, and I won't stand upon it too firmly, but I believe it may be the case that Joseph and Mary were unwilling to take Jesus back to that location until there was no longer a Jew-killing maniac in charge of that. That kind of makes sense to me. I can imagine Mary saying, Joseph, no, we're not going to do this. I know my wife would have said that. All right, small things, right? Small facts, but they get hard things right. And they get them right very casually. They just mention them in passing as if they expect their readers to know that what they're saying is true, as if that there's no question of their defending themselves or forging some kind of elaborate story. It's just mentioned in passing and it goes on. What kind of writings are these? Let's look at Luke. It's one of my favorite passages. Luke 20, verses 24 and 25. Jesus, of course, has come to Jerusalem. This is that crammed week where we have the triumphal entry, and then things go really wrong, and he's going to be dragged before the Sanhedrin and Pilate and killed. But in the middle of things before that happens, the Jewish leaders try to trap Jesus. They have a foolproof trap. They're going to ask him a question, and whether he says yes or no, he loses. They're going to say, "Oh, Rabbi, we know that you are no respecter of persons, and you always tell the truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar?" Now, the Jewish people hated paying taxes, especially to Caesar. And they felt that this was something that they should never have been forced to do. So what can Jesus do? He says, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, and then they'll use that to drive a wedge between him and the people. Or he can say no, and they'll run for the nearest cohort of Roman guards. We're shocked, we tell you, to find this rabbi telling us not to pay our taxes. It can't go wrong, right? The only answers are yes and no. Jesus is toast. How does that go down? He says, show me a denarius. He names a specific coin. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? Something has gone wrong with the trap. You get the feeling that about this time they're staring at their sandals and saying, Caesar's. He said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. We can't appreciate this fully until we see why that reply is so devastating. So let's have a look at a denarius of Tiberius Caesar. Here's the image on the denarius. What does that look like to you? Looks to me like a human head in profile. And what you need to understand is that the Second Temple era in Judaism, the era in which all of this story transpires, was the Puritan era in Judaism. They took a very literal interpretation of what it took to keep or to violate the commandments. The second commandment tells us, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. This kind of looks like something in the earth beneath to me. It looks like a man. Coins minted in Sepphoris in Galilee by the Romans have no likeness of a person or an animal on them in order not to offend the Jewish population. But Jesus said, show me not just any old coin, show me a denarius. This is the imperial coin. Show me that. Okay, whose image does it have? When the Jews rendered their own Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they also sought for a Greek word that meant image, and they use it in Genesis, where we're told that man is made in the image of God. That's the same word that is being used there. And so think about this. What is Jesus saying? Whose image does this bear? Then give it to Caesar's. What's implied? Whose image do you bear? Give that to God, right? Give the money away. It's got Caesar's image on it. But what bears God's image? That would be you. God does not cash out of state checks in heaven. God wants you. Wow, okay, that's a lot to pack in. But you know what? It's better than that, because he also says, whose inscription is this? So as you'll see, there's lettering around here, right? Running around the edge. And that lettering is abbreviated Latin. Augustus Tai Kaiser Divi Aug F. If you spell it out, what this is abbreviation for is Augustus Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. This coin is celebrating the previous Roman emperor as a god. It's the cult of emperor worship, the imperial cult. So this is not just a violation of the second commandment. This is a violation of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. It's no wonder that by the time that day or two of questioning was over, no one dared to ask Jesus any more questions. Wow. But such a small thing, right? Whose image and superscription does it bear? And we can't see what is going on until we actually see the coin and we realize the image and the superscription matter in this context. They lend point to what Jesus is saying. They make this not just some kind of odd, otherworldly, yes, give away money, money doesn't matter. No, this is much more pointed than that. This is very specific. How about temple, but not the temple in Jerusalem? You remember the story of the woman, the Samaritan woman in John 4, the woman at the well. Jesus asks for a drink of water, and it's odd because he's a man, and men don't speak to women in that culture, and he's a Jew, and Jews don't speak to Samaritans. And here's a Jewish man speaking to a Samaritan woman, moreover, a Samaritan woman with, let's say, a rather checkered past, right? And it turns out Jesus knows much more than it is nice to know about her background and her history. Yeah, I know you're not married. You've had 4 husbands, and the guy you're with now isn't even your husband. So she's eager to turn the topic of conversation away from the focus on her. So she says, let's get him talking about some Jews versus Samaritans issue. Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. This mountain is Mount Gerizim, which you can see from Jacob's well. If you're sitting at Jacob's well, you just lift up your eyes. Mount Gerizim is right there. But you say, you Jews, that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Now, Jesus says many beautiful things that form the ground for some wonderful sermons here, but verse 22 usually isn't one of them. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." So far, so good. And then he says, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." What's that all about? Why is Jesus being mean? I mean, I thought Jesus was supposed to be nice and I was supposed to be nice too. Isn't that the gospel? No, maybe that's not the gospel, right? No, Jesus is being very pointed about this to her. And he says, you worship what you do not know. What do those words even mean? Well, you can read all around in the Gospel of John. You will find no answer to this question. It's simply not even addressed any further. But we have a Jewish historian, Josephus, who records for us that back in the 2nd century BC, the Samaritans were afraid that an insane Greek king who thought he was the incarnation of Zeus would attack them. Antiochus IV had become enraged at the Jews. He was mustering an army in the north. He was coming down to besiege Jerusalem. There's an upland spine that runs north-south through Samaria, and that would be the natural way to run an army coming straight down to sack Jerusalem. They were afraid they were going to be caught between the hammer and the anvil. So they wrote Antiochus a note, and in book 12, chapter 5 of the Antiquities, Josephus reproduces this note, which they wrote. And it says, "To Antiochus the god, we are a peaceful people. We are not Jews. It's true that we keep the Sabbath, but that's just because of some events in our own history, not Jews. And it's true that we have a temple. But our temple doesn't even have a name. And we were wondering if you'd mind if in your honor we named it the Temple of Zeus." And Antiochus wrote back, he said, "Do that." And so they did. And he bypassed them when he came down and sacked Jerusalem and broke through and sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem and set off the Maccabean revolt. Now go back to Jesus and the woman at the well. "Oh, your fathers worshipped in this mountain, did they?" What did they worship? Did they have a temple? Tell me, what was it named? No, you do not get to play this equivalence game. We remained faithful. We took the hit. Salvation's coming from the Jews. And now it all makes sense, what Jesus is saying, and why that is his response to that particular statement of hers. Some of you may know Andrew Pinsent. Father Pinsent is a professor at Oxford. He has a doctorate in philosophy from St. Louis University, he has a doctorate in theology from the Pontifical Institute in Rome, and he has a doctorate in nuclear physics from Oxford. He's kind of a smart guy. And when I told him this, his jaw dropped. He said, but why didn't they tell me this in Rome? They told me that whole scene probably never happened. Why didn't anyone ever tell me this? I said, well, maybe you should go back and ask them. I don't know, Andrew. Why didn't they tell you this? But it makes these things stand out more vividly. If you want more of this kind of thing, and I will share these slides with everyone, but I just want to show you that there are resources for this. There are nearly 40 more examples of this sort in one chapter in William Paley's book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity, which I can give you for free. It's out of copyright. It's in the public domain. I can give you a PDF copy of that for nothing. So it's yours for the asking. But in part 2, chapter 6, Paley goes through 40-some examples of this sort from the Gospels and the book of Acts. For a very extensive treatment of this, Paley has quarried those 40-some examples out of the 17 volumes of Nathaniel Lardner's Credibility of the Gospel History, which is still very good reading today. I can also give you all 17 volumes of Lardner. They are free to a good home, so let me know. Like cute little kittens, right? I can give them away for free, just if you'll take good care of them. If you want a detailed discussion, we didn't discuss the book of Acts, but there's wonderful detail in the last few chapters of Acts. There's a book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, which does this kind of historical analysis for that entire voyage and shipwreck. It's extensive. It's beyond compelling. You really need to have a look at this if you have any interest in the book of Acts. Quite wonderful material. Smith argues for two main claims. The writer of the book of Acts was an eyewitness, and he was not a sailor. He was a landlubber. He didn't know the sea because there are many things he reports that he clearly does not understand, or he would tell you more about why they had to do them. And for a more recent discussion of the historical evidence, I highly recommend Colin Heemer, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. This is a magisterial piece of work by a classicist and New Testament scholar, unfortunately taken from us just as he was completing this work, but it remains an absolute classic, and I can't recommend it too highly. My wife and I imposed upon the publisher to reissue this. It was out of print, but it is back in print now, and so you can get a copy of this online. Okay. Back to our map of the terrain. I've done some external evidence, and let's talk about some internal evidence. And this raises a curious question. How can you tell just by comparing two Gospels that there's something particularly credible about them? And isn't that circular, kind of like using the Bible to prove the Bible or something? Well, let's back up. First of all, why do we have 4 Gospels at all? Why couldn't the Christians get their act together and just write us one narrative, top to bottom, telling us what happened, when it happened? Then we wouldn't have all these problems of trying to coordinate these bits and say, well, do these harmonize? Is this even the same event? How does this all work? It's so difficult for us. We're frustrated. It provides scope for people to quibble about things. Why do we have to have 4 Gospels? And what I'm going to argue is that that's related to the question, can we tell by comparing 2 passages of Scripture with one another that both of them are authentic, credible accounts? What's your first natural answer? Well, we can find places where 2 of the Gospels tell the same story and maybe even in the same words, yes. But let your inner skeptic free for a moment, right? What's the obvious thing that someone will say if you say, well, they tell the same story? Right, you know why they tell the same story? For the same reason that 2 copies of today's newspaper tell the same story. One of them's, copied from the other. And how would you argue that didn't happen? Maybe it did. Some of the stories in the Gospels do seem very similar in wording as well as in event to other stories. That's not implausible with respect to them, so we can't do it that way. So how can we rule out the possibility that one is just copying from the other on internal evidence? Well, this is where we want to look at what are called undesigned coincidences. These are not intended by their authors as intersections of their books, but they do intersect. They interlock, in fact. Maybe one book mentions in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other. Such interlocking would be unlikely if one of them were copied from the other, because then they would say much the same thing, right? Rather than explaining one another. It would be unlikely if they were both copied from a common source, because again, they would say much the same thing. And it would be unlikely if the latter book simply added a bunch of legends to the former, which is, of course, what we are frequently told about the Gospels. Fictions and forgeries don't interlock like this. Nobody picks up a copy of War and Peace to answer the questions left over when you finished reading Moby Dick. They're not anchored in the same independent historical reality. So you can't get this kind of thing, at least not in any very extensive way, with fictions and forgeries. Either they don't interlock at all, or if someone is doing a forgery, the interlockings are very obvious and they kind of hit you over the head with it. And we know this because we know what fictions and forgeries look like. We have them. We don't have to guess what a forger would do. We can calibrate our expectations by looking at what they do. So this is not guesswork. This is not fine-sounding theorizing. We actually have concrete examples of this. We have spurious Gospels from the 2nd century. We have forgeries like the donation of Constantine. We have lots and lots of forgeries and fictions that we can look at. But we would expect to find such undesigned coincidences in authentic records of the same real event told by different people who knew what they were talking about. If we have very extensive records like this, we would expect that we would find these places where they interlock, where one person leaves something out, and that creates a worry or a problem, and the other person, just in passing, mentions something that solves our problem. So I'm going to use the word depth for this one. Okay, dates and details, eating, petty bickering, the temple taunt, and Herod and his servants. So if you like mnemonic devices, then this can be one that you can use. And again, I don't expect anyone to write all of this down. I'll be happy to share the slides, although I'll be very impressed if you remember these just by my little fact and depth acronyms. Then you're really good if you can do that. All right, so dates and details. In John 2:20, Jesus has just performed the cleansing of the temple in John, which I would say is a different event from the cleansing that we find in the Synoptics. And I'll argue that in part on the basis of what I'm about to show you. The Jews are asking, well, by what authority do you do this? And he says, destroy this temple, I will raise it again in 3 days. They say, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days. Yeah, right, man. We believe you. I like this bit right here. I like the 46 years. Because you see, we know roughly when work began on the temple. It was one of Herod the Great's building projects. Herod the Great was not all that great. My daughter calls him Herod the Jerk. But he was a great builder, and he left many magnificent building projects, and that is where he gets his name. He began construction of the temple in about 18 BC. So if we run the clock forward, remembering there's no year zero, right? We just go from 1 BC to 1 AD. Jesus' first confrontation in the temple at the beginning of his public ministry took place about the year 27, 28. Remember, the Jews would count part of a year as a year, right? So we're right around 27 or 28 to get 46 years here for this conversation to be taking place when they say, it took 46 years to build this temple. Interesting. So Jesus' public ministry beginning 27, 28. Okay, you say that was a nice bit of math, but this could all still be fiction. I don't care. Right? Okay, now go over to Luke chapter 3. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, right? Pontius Pilate being governor, Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, so he nails this down with names of all these people. Well, what was the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar? Caesar Augustus died in the year 14. But he had made his adopted son Tiberius co-emperor with him 2 years earlier, in the year 12. And Roman coins celebrating Tiberius as emperor, date the beginning of that back to the year 12. So let's take that and run with it. Where does that put us in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar? That puts John the Baptist's public ministry in the year 26 or 27, again, depending on how much of a year is counted as that last bit. Which means John the Baptist's ministry, and that's what all of this is heralding, took place just prior to Jesus' ministry, which is exactly what we're told in the Gospels. But do you notice how we have to do all this careful mapping of this to see the numerical coincidence? It's not on the surface. You have to actually have some knowledge of when the temple began being built, when Tiberius became emperor, and then you have to coordinate these things before you can put them together. Does this look like the work of somebody who couldn't get his internet active today, and so he just made up some dates for his story? No, is the answer. There will be a quiz. One other thing, while I'm on this Luke 3:1. If you read a lot of Roman history and a lot of history in general, Greco-Roman history, from the time, you'll discover something, which is that almost all history is written from the perspective of the great. It's written from the perspective of the emperors, the senators, the generals. Sometimes those who are viewed as intellectually great, sometimes, a great rhetorician, a Cicero, or a great philosopher may come in. But it is not written from the perspective of the common man. And when the common man wanders through the story, when a serf or a slave comes through the story, it's setting up something for someone who's important, someone who matters. We're going to learn something here about, Tiberius, or we're going to learn something about Nero, and this is just sort of stage setting. When a crowd shows up, it's bad news. Crowds are bad in these histories. They're either something terrible is going to happen, or some statesman is going to illustrate his power of command of rhetoric by swaying the crowd and making them disperse peacefully. Crowds are never a good thing. But what do we find in the Gospels? There was a great movement some 30, 40 years ago to do social history, like what was happening to the average guy during the French Revolution. And the trouble is, the documents of ancient history don't talk much about the average guy, so you had to read between the lines, except when you get to the Gospels. Because when you get to the Gospels, you find they're all about peasants. And when Jesus sees a crowd, he has compassion on them because they're harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And when Luke begins the 3rd chapter of his gospel in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, what are all these great rulers being named to nail down? The appearance of a peasant prophet wandering in the wilderness. You don't have to read between the lines to find out what's happening to the ordinary guy. You just have to read what's on the lines. This is the holy grail of social history. But it's right here in front of you. I don't think people appreciate this enough. So anyway, Jesus' public ministry begins just about the time that John's is shut down, which is exactly what we're told in the Gospels. Eating. I like this one. I often present this one as an exercise. So some of you have heard me do this. We're going to play the game here, but if you've heard me do this, you are not eligible to play, all right? So you have to just sit there like, I know, the teacher's not going to call on you, all right? But here's the beginning of a miracle story, right? John 6:4, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to, and now it's going to name one of his disciples. It's going to be a miracle story. You may know enough about your Bible to know this is the feeding of the 5,000 as it's told in John, and you're right, it is. So we want to make up our own version of the story, though. We're going to invent it because we know a lot about the Bible, right? Many of you have read through the Gospels a time or two. But we're going to do what we're always being told is done all through the Gospels. We're going to make up a story, and we're going to pass it off as though we're authentic. We're going to forge a story about Jesus, but we're going to fool them. So Jesus is going to turn to somebody. The story's going to be about money and food. Which disciple shall we pick to fool them? Judas, he's got the money bag. Right, I think we could fool him with Judas. I think that would work. Anybody else with any connection to money? Matthew was a tax collector. And maybe if we feel awkward about putting the man who's going to betray Jesus in there, maybe we could do Matthew instead. Or we could just pick Peter, because Peter is everywhere in the gospel, so who would know the difference? Right? So, yeah, I think we could do this. We could probably fool them any of those ways. And then we actually see what John wrote. And he says, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Philip? I mean, be it said with all due respect, but Philip is as close to a non-entity as it is possible for one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ to be, right? In all the Gospels, Jesus speaks to him twice, and this is one of them. Why would you pick Philip if you were forging a story? What would the point be? Well, let's connect the dots. This one's interesting, because the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is actually told in all 4 Gospels. So we have lots of chances to try to find some kind of connection. Let's go back to Luke chapter 9, where we also have the feeding of the 5,000. See what we can glean there. Luke 9, 10, 11. "And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him." You alertly notice this doesn't tell us anything about Philip. And you're right. But it does tell us something that we don't find in John 6, and that is where it took place. Now, back to John, skip forward 6 chapters, totally different scene. Some Greeks come, they want to speak to Jesus, and they come up to Philip. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and they said, "Sir, we would speak with Jesus." All right, let's put all 3 of these pieces together now, right? Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle. But when you put them together, Jesus is saying, "Philip, you're from around here. You think the local stores are open late? Do they stock enough to feed this crowd?" And Philip's like, "You've got to be kidding me." Right, now it makes sense, but it's not what any of us would have chosen to invent a story. This is the ring of truth. This doesn't read like somebody's making it up. In fact, I would venture to guess that until you heard me say it, none of you ever noticed this, did you? I'm the son of a Bible college professor. I can sing you the Greek alphabet to the tune of a children's song, okay? I thought I knew this stuff pretty well, and then I came across this stuff just a dozen years ago or so. I was blown away. This stuff has been right in front of my eyes the whole time. How many times have I read through the Gospels, right? You know how you do this, right? You open it up like, Gospel according to Matthew. Okay, let's read about the genealogy of Jesus. Wow, that was boring. Okay, then he's born, and then he flight into Egypt, wise men, yep. Okay, and we keep going. John the Baptist, interesting fellow, right? Temptation in the wilderness, keep going. And you get all the way to the end of it, and you get the Great Commission, and then you turn the page. Mark chapter 1, whoa, quotation from Isaiah right there in the front of it. That's kind of cool. And then you read all the way through Mark. You don't read across. You don't read horizontally and connect these things. You just read vertically, which is good. We should read vertically. I'm not saying anything against reading vertically, but we should also read horizontally. We should also connect these things. And when we do, we discover these beautiful things hidden in plain view. They're right there on the page. You don't have to become an expert in archaeology or in the patristic fathers in order to be able to have this. This is between the covers of your own Bible. You have it with you. You just have to learn to read it the right way. Petty bickering. That's the P. We're almost done. Luke 22:27. Jesus is sitting at the Last Supper with his disciples. Things are going to go wrong really shortly after this. But he says to them, "I am among you as the one who serves." What does he mean by that? Well, Jesus is a servant. Yeah, in Luke, in the immediate passage, Jesus is ordering them around. He's telling them where to go find a donkey and find the upper room and set things up. And Jesus is in charge there. He doesn't look like a servant at all. But here he says to them, "I am among you as the one who serves." What would they think of when he said that? Please don't simply take my word for this. I've done this wrong if you go away and you don't open up your own Bibles and go back and check and see what's in there, because I'm making all these claims about what's not there and I could be lying to you. Don't take my word for it. Anytime anyone gives you a Bible passage that says this is what it means, read it for yourself. Whether it's me or Bart Ehrman, especially if it's Bart Ehrman because he has this little honesty problem, but you need to read these things for yourself. What does this even mean? Context, I claim, and I want you to go and verify independently, provides no clue. Well, when else do we have the story of the Last Supper? Oh, golly, we've got this in all the Gospels. Great. Let's go to John 13, which I stoutly maintain is the same supper, and see what John tells us happens at that supper. Jesus rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. This is a menial job considered to be so degrading, right? I mean, guys, sandals, dust, people's sweaty feet. This is not a fun job. That a Jewish servant could not even be compelled to do it. Jesus did it, and he did it voluntarily. Notice, John doesn't say, please go back and read this. John doesn't say what provoked that vivid object lesson, but Luke does. Luke, a few verses up earlier in Luke 22, tells us a dispute arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And Jesus is saying, I'm among you as one who serves. Why would Jesus have given them this object in servanthood? Because they were just arguing about how great they were and whether Peter was greater than John. No, guys. No, that's not what it's like at all. So, John gives us the explanation for what Luke could even mean in saying, I am among you as one who serves. But Luke gives us the immediate context that explains why Jesus would feel moved to engage in this act of servanthood as an object lesson for them. Which of these authors copied from the other one? The answer is no. This was a trick question. The professor was trying to trick you. Neither of these authors copied from the other one. And if you cannot see that, you have not learned to read. If you say, but they must have copied from one another, then I'm sorry. You're in the grip of a powerful philosophical claim, and you are not actually reading the texts. The temple taunt. You'll recall that as Jesus is being accused, some of the people say to the Jewish readers, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I'll build another not made with hands. And then when he's actually on the cross, when he's being crucified, some people come by and they mock him and they say, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. All right, well, what's that all about? Because I've got to tell you, in the Gospel of Mark, you don't know what it's about, and you can't find it out by reading Matthew, and you can't find out by reading Luke, because there's just no context for why they would say there was anything about Jesus and destroying the temple and what that's all about. No, you get that only if you go over to the Gospel of John. So John explains the taunt, because remember when Jesus has just cleansed the temple and they say, by what authority? What sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up. It's obvious that comment of his got sent around and morphed into, he claimed he was going to destroy the temple, right? It's just like going through airport security. You don't want to say the word bomb. You don't even want to say, I don't have a bomb. You just don't want to say it. This is just, no, bad career move. Do not do this, right? Word went around distorting the original utterance that Jesus was going to be some kind of terrorist. So John gives us Jesus' original statement, but John never gives its use as an accusation. He doesn't say that in his account of the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus in John 18, John 19. You don't get that there. The Synoptic Gospels give us the accusation, but they don't give us the original statement. Neither of these passages is copied from the other. That's not the way this works. Do you see what I'm saying? This is not just like, they're saying the same thing. It's very different. This is some of that rich texture of historical evidence that I was talking about this morning when I said, look, this is not just a matter of one person says X happened and another person says, yes, X happened, and the third person says X happened. It's very different from that. Historical evidence is wonderful in its texture, and it can give us things that mere assertion cannot. Final one, I'm wrapping up here for those of you who are about to go to sleep. And by the way, I understand some of you need to leave, so feel free to just wander out at any time. I won't be offended. It's late. You didn't really ask to be here all night. So, Matthew 14 tells us the story of the death of John the Baptist. And as he sets this up, he's talking about Herod, Tetrarch of Galilee. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. And he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are working. I had John killed. What is this? I'm interested in the words, to his servants. And one of the reasons that I am interested is that although the story of the death of John the Baptist is told in all the synoptic gospels, the words to his servants appear only in Matthew, not in any of the other accounts. Please go look up the cross-references and check me on this. So, how would Matthew know what Herod had said to his servants? Matthew's just a tax collector who turned traveling preacher. He doesn't get to hang out in Herod's palace. How should he know? Now, maybe the answer is we don't know. And that could be okay. There are many times when there are claims in historical documents, so it's the only time that it's claimed. We don't have any second source that corroborates it. That doesn't mean it's not true. But wouldn't it be interesting if we had a way of knowing how Matthew would know what Herod said to his servants? Well, read all round in Matthew. Go back all the way to chapter 1 if you like. You'll find no explanation for this. But in the Gospel of Luke, not the story of the death of John the Baptist, it opens with mention of some women who supported the ministry of Jesus and his disciples, probably some of them with money, some of them with food. And in Luke 8, verse 3, one of those women is named, she's Joanna. We don't talk a lot about Joanna, do we? She's the wife of Chuza. Great. Who's Chuza? Oh, he's Herod's household manager. He's Herod's steward. Oh. So Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants, right? So now this isn't a mystery at all, how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. You want more? Well, ask me for this book. John James Blunt, The Veracity of the Gospels and Acts, expanded later under the title Undesigned Coincidences, and so it is to Blunt that we owe that name for this kind of evidence. But Blunt's work was published in the middle of the 19th century, and there are a few examples where Blunt makes an argument, but it's based on a reading from the Byzantine text family that is different in the Alexandrian text family. And since the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus and the advent of really sophisticated textual criticism, many people would like to say, well, probably that's not what was originally written. And so if you want to see an updated version that takes into account all the textual criticism, my wife's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, goes not only through all of these gospel examples and many more. They crisscross the Gospels in all directions, by the way. There's no single preferred direction here. John explains things in the Synoptics explain things in John, the Synoptics explain things in one another. They're all over the place like that. So if you want the most up-to-date version of that, you can pick up her book, but if you want the free one because you're a student and you're poor, then you want Blunt. I'll just close with an epigraph as well. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. I hope that I have at least piqued your interest with some of this evidence that they were indeed eyewitnesses writing about what they knew, which they had seen and their hands had handled.
Yeah, thanks for this brilliant presentation.
Thank
I
you.
have read a commentary of First of Moses from Fruchtenbaum, and there are other commentators saying that you can recognize the correctness of the Bible text by the numerical order of how many words appear and in what order they are and so on. And do you know anything about
Right.
that?
So I have some of, it's Arnold Furstenbaum, right, that you're talking about, right. I have some of his work. Because he is steeped in the Jewish training and he's referring so carefully to the numerical things, I have not taken the time to do my own investigation of these things to see whether they're so. It's certainly, the claims are remarkable if he can substantiate them, and perhaps he can. I'm saying nothing against it, then that's quite interesting. But for me, the kind of evidence that I've always found most compelling is the kind I've been showing you here, where there's nothing sort of arcane about it. There's no special kind of reasoning that you have to do from special information about the way that Jewish scribes counted the vowels or counted out the letters and found the middle letter of the chapter or things like that. This is just right up on its face, and everybody can get this kind of evidence. I've given this talk at a church, or a portion of it, and the first person to come up to me was a prosecuting attorney, a lawyer, and he said, "I'm a specialist in evidence. I want more of that." Well, I'd come prepared. I had a little stack of books, so I gave him a book. Fifth person in line was a construction worker, like 6'6", looming over me. "I want more of that." I looked up at him and I said, "Okay, what level are you looking for?" "Whatever level you was talking at, that's the level I want." So I gave him a book, right? I mean, I'm a professor. I give people books. So yeah, but everybody gets this. Everybody gets the undesigned coincidences. And once they get them, they're not going to be fooled by the clever modern New Testament scholar who tells them, "Oh, no, none of these things really happen. This is just an elaborate wreath of legend around some very small kernel of what might be fact." They're going to say, "Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I see past that now. Not good enough. Try again." Right? By the way, I sometimes like to say, when you drink deeply of New Testament criticism and you get to the bottom of the beer mug, there's David Hume staring back at you, which is why I gave the talk that I did earlier today. But I am very much afraid that philosophical assumptions are driving the history, not the history leading us to whatever conclusions we ought to draw philosophically. The idea that miracles cannot happen is, or at least that we could never justifiably believe them, is blocking us off from the evidence. I sometimes tell my students, because I teach the theory of knowledge, I say, look, here's a very important question. If you are wrong, how will you find out? It's one of the most important questions you can ask. And if you are ruthless in the application of that question, you constantly ask yourself, when should I change my mind? And you work out a set of good principles, and then you're willing to abide by all consequences and use that everywhere, then I'll take my chances with what you end up believing. That's fine. But if you absolutely refuse to acknowledge a certain kind of truth, even if it's there, then that's not a rational way to live your life. Although some people with some fantastic learning and elaborate degrees do seem to live their lives. There's a world into which many New Testament scholars wander, and some of them seem perpetually to inhabit it, that is not the world in which I live. In my world, almost all books that are not government documents are written by one person and not by a committee, but in their world, every book is written by a whole series of committees, the Johannine community and the third redactor, and we've got, just like, well, but I mean, you're dealing with ancient literature. How many co-authored books do you have in the ancient world? Can you think of any offhand? Oh, yeah, that's kind of a problem, isn't it? Right? When in my world, if a man makes an unusual catch of fish, he measures them and he weighs them, and then he tells his friends all the details about how many fish he caught and how long they were and how much they weighed, and he tells his friends until he doesn't have any friends anymore. But in that world they inhabit, if anyone says that they put down their nets and caught 153 fish, well, it's just obviously mythical, and the number has to have some kind of theological significance. I just said, I don't understand, right? We were talking a bit about Troeltsch and his principle of analogy. I don't think these people know what analogy means, right? They've lost touch with living historical reality.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk and presentation. I think you have convincingly shown by your examples that John has not copied from Luke and Luke not from John and so on. But I think there are some pretty good arguments for and widespread accepting in the exegesis that Mark or no, that Luke and Matthew have independently from another copied from Mark, which is according to this thesis.
Right, so the thesis is called Markan priority.
Would you reject this also, or can you accept?
No, I can accept that as long as you will do something that most people who talk that way won't do, right? When we see that Mark tells the story of the death of John the Baptist, and then we see that Matthew tells the story of the death of John the Baptist, all I'm going to ask you to do is not ignore the fact that Matthew and not Mark has the words to his servants. Mm-hmm. So even in cases where, to use the language of New Testament criticism, we have the same pericope and there's substantial verbal similarity, it's still the case that Matthew has some independent stuff which suggests, if it can be cross-checked, which in this case it can with Luke 8:3, it suggests that Matthew has an independent source of information as well as the information in Mark, and seems to be making use of both. Yep. If you're willing to grant me that, I have no quarrel with Markan priority. It may be true. That's fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Also, though, I want to say this. What you're referring to is called the synoptic problem.
Yes.
Right? The problem of the order in which the Gospels are written, the dependencies. And what the argument from undesigned coincidence does is it shows that the synoptic problem matters a great deal less than some people think it does. Because I don't care if you take Markan priority, I don't care if you take the Farrer hypothesis, I don't care if you take the Lucan priority theory of Lindsay and Bivens. It doesn't matter. All of these guys have some independent sources of information. Yeah. And we can find places where that independent information answers questions that are raised in other Gospels. So it lowers the stakes, right? This is no longer a high-stakes game. Well, but did Mark come first or Matthew? It doesn't matter as much as you might have thought it matters.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that a fair answer?
Yeah, okay.
All right.
Hi, thanks again as well, just like the other said. What I learned a long time ago when I was in high school and was being taught religion by probably a pupil of a smart New Testament scholar was that there was probably this source, Q, the Quelle, so they probably learned from some German smart New Testament scholar, and that was where it all came from. So it's probably in line with the previous question. I mean, is that still a live option, or are people talking about this?
It's live, but it's in the hospital and not doing too well right now. So Mark Goodacre, N.T. Wright, and some other scholars have contributed to some books. There's one called World Without Q. Basically, Q is an entirely hypothetical document. And the longer you look at it, the more it begins to look an awful lot like parts of Matthew. Now, what we learn from a quotation of Papias, preserved in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, is that Matthew wrote the Logia, whatever that means, as disputed, in the Hebrew dialect, probably Aramaic, and everyone interpreted them as best he could. So, without resorting to any hypothetical documents that nobody ever mentions anywhere in the ancient world, I'd like to take that line from Papias and say this is at least plausible. Matthew wrote a sort of first draft of his gospel, but he wrote it in Aramaic, and it circulated among the people who could read Aramaic. Mark wrote his gospel from the preaching of Peter. And somebody said, yeah, but you know what? Matthew was a disciple, and we already have his stuff. And so somebody came along, maybe Matthew himself, and transposed the original material into Greek and incorporated the narrative framework that Mark gives us. And that, honestly, that accounts really well for the data and has the merit that it does not involve our invoking a completely hypothetical document that neither Papias, nor Tertullian, nor Eusebius, nor Irenaeus, nor anyone else ever mentions. So that, I hold that view lightly. I could be mistaken, but it seems to me to make better sense than the Q hypothesis.
So in the Quran, the death of Jesus of Nazareth is denied.
Yes.
It's one of the tenets,
Yeah.
Maqatilu Masalabu,
Yeah.
in Arabic. If, based on your reading and understanding of historical literature regarding that period of time, was it 600 AD when that was written? Can you comment on the death of Jesus in regard to the historical literature at the time and during the time of the Quran, if you have?
Yeah, so you'll notice that the swoon theory doesn't come up until, nearly the year 1800 with Venturini, right? I mean, the idea that Jesus didn't really die, of course, in the Islamic version, there's sort of an instantaneous switch, and somebody else is made to look like Jesus, and that guy gets crucified, and Jesus is taken out of danger in a way. But yeah, the swoon theory, which is the closest thing we have to it, doesn't even get mentioned, even by skeptics. You could read Celsus, right, of the 2nd century, in his book, The True Word, where he's mocking the Christians in every way he possibly can. He never denies that Jesus died on the cross. In one of the barracks for soldiers for, it's like Colosseum fights, there's something called the Alexamenos Graffito. And this is just sort of scored into the wall. It's a very crude picture of a cross with a body on it and a donkey's head on the top. And underneath, somebody has written in rather childish letters, Alexamenos worships his God, right? He's worshiping an ass. The guy got crucified. But to us, this is evidence that it was widely known that Jesus was crucified, right? So there's just no hint of this in any source for centuries. Just like there's no hint in any existing source that any Christian ever raised any doubt about the authorship of the Gospels. You've got two things there. Somebody mentions some elogi, we don't even know their names, who tried to say John's Gospel was written by Cerinthus, and everybody just laughed them out of court. They're mentioned only to be dismissed. And then you've got to wait until nearly the year 400, 397, when Faustus the Manichaean tries to say, oh, maybe Matthew didn't really write that gospel that you call by his name, because in Matthew 9, verse 9, we hear about the calling of the disciple, and it says, and he rose and followed him. Well, if Matthew's writing it himself, says Faustus, no doubt thinking himself wonderfully clever, why doesn't he say, I rose and followed him? Now, to get the full effect of this, you have to go and look up Augustine's Contra Faustum, because Augustine is absolutely withering. He says, Faustus cannot possibly be so ignorant that he does not know that it's common in historical writers when referring to themselves to refer as to another. This is so common I won't even give examples. Everybody knows this, says Augustine, the professional rhetorician, right? It is more likely, he says, that he wished by this means to gain a hold over others more ignorant than himself. Same argument's being used 1,600 years later by Bart Ehrman, by the way, in his book Jesus Interrupted. Bart, I'd like to introduce you to Aurelius Augustine. I think you guys should talk. So, yeah, there is no other tradition. There is no hint of any of that until Muhammad found it inconvenient to take that view as the view he wanted to put in the Quran.
What about possible interpolations, later interpolations, which try to amend errors of Gospels that were written earlier?
Right.
So, but couldn't be changed because they were already canonical
Sure, or as good as canonical, right. So if you look at the textual criticism, we've got different text families. They fall into broad families that have a lot of similarity. And there's one text family that absolutely has the most interpolations, the most omissions. It's the Adams family of New Testament text families. It's just a total set of monstrosities, and that's the Western text family. And honestly, except when it is convenient for them, almost all scholars say, well, yeah, I mean, the Western text family, pretty much, you're going to get a bunch of craziness like that, but the Alexandrian text family is much more uniform, much more spare. I'm not saying that there are no small additions, but they're very small things, and so far as I know, not one textual variant, this is something that Lydia and I worked on as she was working on the book, not a single textual variant touches any of the undesigned coincidences that I've given you, nor any of the several dozen others in her book. There just is no significant evidence of any textual tampering to produce anything like these effects. So whatever variations there are, and most of the variations are spelling variations, proving that first century scribes and second century scribes could spell no better than my students can, they are not going to produce these kinds of interconnections. So it's a fair question. It deserves a straight up answer, but the only tool we have for doing that is to look at our texts, and they just don't bear any sign of that in these places.
Speaking about text families, concerning the Alexandrian text family and the Byzantine text family, did you find evidence that concerning this claim that the Alexandrian family is more reliable?
I think that there are places where it probably is, and I'm broadly sympathetic to taking it very seriously as sort of the basis for our reconstruction of the closest thing we can get to what was originally put down on papyrus. I would not be rigid about that. I'd be somewhat eclectic. There are a few cases where I think, but you can make a good case for a Byzantine text reading. And so I would not take just a rigid Alexandrian text-only view. I think the work of Bruce Metzger is exemplary in this area. Metzger was a very great textual scholar and was, in fact, Bart Ehrman's dissertation advisor. Bart was his last doctoral student. But, very much unlike Bart, who went on to lose his faith and write books against Christianity, Metzger was quite evangelical. And one of his students has told me that when his students would go home for the summer, many of them would go and preach in their hometowns, even preach in revival meetings. And when they would come back in the fall, Metzger would get them into his office and he'd close the door, and then in a quiet voice, he'd say, "How many were saved?" So he didn't find this at all undermining or threatening to his faith. And I think it's a beautiful example of a great scholar and a very pious man at the same time.
What do you think is wrong with these smart New Testament scholars? I mean, you mentioned that if you drink the cup, you see Hume at the bottom.
Right.
Is there something more? What is sort of the philosophical glasses through which they are looking at these texts that makes them unable to, see what you are seeing?
There's been a lot of research that's been done in recent decades on human cognitive biases. And one of the most prevalent biases and one of the hardest to shake, because it's everybody's problem, it's my problem, it's your problem, it's their problem, is what is called confirmation bias. You see what you expect to see. What you don't expect to see gets shunted aside. You can see a sort of non-threatening version of this in the frequency illusion, right? You buy a new car, at least new to you, maybe it's used, but you got some car, you kind of like the model, and you're driving it down the street for the first time, and golly, there's one, and there's one, and there's, like, everybody's got your car. Why, are you setting the trend? No, they were there all along. You just weren't noticing them until your attention was drawn to the features of this car, and now you start picking it up, right? Now, that's not threatening. That's not a problem. But when the frequency illusion goes from passive to active, where you're looking for things that confirm your views, then we have a real recipe for brilliant people, truly wonderful scholars, to get themselves so completely out into the wilderness, they have no idea they're lost. So I think that's that. some really bad philosophy, and a kind of disciplinary inertia are problems. Some people suffer from a very strong desire to be part of the inner circle, to be accepted by the academics who are really the people who are the movers and shakers. And if they're on the outside of that group and they want to get in, it's just a soul-destroying ambition. And it can ruin people's ability to be objective in the analysis of evidence. Such cases lie not only within my knowledge, but within my experience. I've seen this happen, and it's terribly sad because they lose the ability to say, hey, wait, what if I'm wrong? Maybe I should listen to somebody who disagrees with me, right? Someone who was here was telling me a story about something that happened in Tübingen. This is your story, right? You were telling me about the student who said, well, maybe Jesus did just make this prediction in Mark, right? And the professor said, if you don't want to understand Mark, you can just leave now. Wow, all right, not winning the objectivity award here. So, yeah. There's no doubt there are even more factors. The influence of David Hume on David Friedrich Strauss comes out. It's there in his Life of Jesus, the Leben Jesu. But if you read his New Life of Jesus for the German People, a later work of his, not just repeating it, he very explicitly credits Hume as having given the argument for just regarding these miracle stories as untenable. We cannot accept them. And so Hume casts this long, baleful shadow across the 19th century, and Strauss is, of course, tremendously influential on all subsequent biblical criticism. Not that everyone agrees with all of his ideas, but he's still tremendously influential.
Yes, Hume was also influential in Germany, but maybe also Immanuel Kant, who was influenced by Hume, and also Hegel.
Right.
Some of the thinkers were influenced by Hegel, or many by Kant, because Schleiermacher was influenced by Kant.
Right.
For theology. I got a question. There was the last 2-3 years, some people announced that scripture was found of the 1st century of Mark, or something like that. And then it was found that it wasn't the case. And I was wondering if you could summarize that.
Right.
And also, what is your expectation? Will there be more things found? Or
right. So what happened is that there are just hundreds and hundreds of Egyptian funerary masks which were used for burial, and they're composed by taking papyrus and turning it into a kind of papier-mâché and then forming the mask and putting it down. And if you're very, very careful, you can take these masks, which are not intrinsically valuable, and you can separate the papyrus layers, and sometimes you can read what's on the little strips and snippets of papyrus. So word went out that there was a papyrus fragment of the Gospel of Mark, which was dated to the 1st century. And Daniel Wallace was one of the people who sort of said, hey, this is coming out. And then it didn't come out, and it didn't come out, and it didn't come out, and it didn't come out. And finally, several years later, it was published, and it was not a 1st century fragment. And Wallace then wrote on his blog, he said, I feel terrible about this, but when they let me have a look at it, I had to sign a very strict non-disclosure agreement that said that I would say nothing about this until it was published. So just after I announced it, they said, well, would you like to look at it? Sign this document. And then he'd known for quite some time that it was not dated to the 1st century, and he wasn't allowed to say anything. So it was not his fault. And some people got a little upset with him because, well, why didn't you tell us the truth? Well, lawyers got involved, right? And so there are lots more of those things there. But look, there are untranslated manuscripts sitting in museum drawers all across the world. It's not like there's just 3 or 4 of them out there and then we'll be done. There's stuff like this, there's more of it than we know what to do with. So nobody particularly thinks, oh yes, next year we'll find a 1st century fragment of Mark. But again, nobody can say that we won't. It's just, papyrus is very fragile. Time and water and fire are not kind to papyrus. And the inks were usually just done with a charcoal, oil, and water-based ink, and it's not very. It's not set to endure for many, many centuries, except under very special conditions and very dry conditions. And so it's impossible to say at this point and from our vantage point that we will, and it's really not possible to say that we won't. We just have to wait. Some really interesting stuff has turned up in textual criticism, so we might get more.
And there's this number I often hear that 97 to 99% of the original text of the New Testament can be reconstructed through textual criticism. Is that true even in light of the fact that the earliest manuscripts are from 125 or 250, the first full?
Yeah, it is. I mean, if you take something like P75, I believe it is, and you compare it to Codex Sinaiticus or Alexandricus, you find that it's there's actually not a very substantial amount of difference. So this papyrus from the 2nd century and the Codex, which is of course written on vellum, very nice, that's written in the early 4th century when Constantine decided it would be a grand thing to have a couple of these made. Actually, there's not all that much variation. They're really quite similar, and that is itself one way of calibrating our expectations as to how rapidly significant shifts took place in the evidence. So that would be the sort of the first place to go. I have a friend who wrote a master's thesis on that subject. All right, very good. And thank all of you. It's very flattering that you would want to come out this late in the evening and listen to a talk from someone in a field that is not his professional specialty. So I do thank you again.